We're so delighted that Paul Chapman approached us and the library with this program. And certainly from the audience showing, it looks like it was something that's very timely and obviously tapped into the interest of a lot of people around the shoreline. I'm going to introduce Paul Chapman. He says he's a retired activist, and I don't believe it for a second. The retired part, I don't think when you're an activist you ever retire, and I think he'll prove that to you today as well. He has lectured for decades about ways to overcome persistent divisions in society. While studying in Switzerland in 1956, he read reports that described how in 1933, Hitler established a national church embracing a Christianity under his control. Many pastors were encouraged by Hitler, and swastikas were soon hanging in church sanctuaries. While many churches slid into racism and neo-paganism, others were appalled and did not submit. Reading these reports sparked Paul's lifelong interest in the German resistance to Hitler. In pursuit of this interest, he traveled to Germany and Poland, befriended some of the survivors of the Widerstands, and accumulated a small library of their thoughts and deeds, and he's going to present his knowledge, his research, and his experience with us today. So please welcome Paul Chapman.
I wrote that description of who I am, and now I don't have to read the first paragraph of my talk. It was actually 1956. I finished graduate school, had no idea what in the world to do, so I went to my professor, Paul Meinia, whom some of you knew when he retired at Guilford, and he said, go to the Ecumenical Institute attached to the University of Geneva. And it was there that I came across this lifelong interest in pursuing how was it possible that Hitler took control of the country so apparently easily and totally. And my father was a pastor at the time, and I thought to myself, would he have succumbed to this idea of a church renewal? He was very interested in renewal, and he was not the least bit political. And I imagined that he could. And it was a very disturbing thought. And then I thought, I don't know anything about German resistance to Hitler. I know about the French resistance. I know a little bit about the Dutch resistance. But Germans? No, I saw them all as a bloc in support of Hitler, and soon learned otherwise. As a result of World War II, World War I, Germany was profoundly demoralized. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I were intentionally punitive, and the Germans throughout the land suffered greatly, especially the little people. Unemployment reached 70%, and inflation was out of control. There's a slide of 3 slides, actually. A man taking Reichsmarks, piles of Reichsmarks to market to buy something. In the middle, that's children playing with blocks of Reichsmarks. And then at the end, a woman or a man, I don't know which it is, starting a fire in the stove with Reichsmarks. In 1919, $1 bought 8 Reichsmarks. 4 years later, $1 bought 4 trillion Reichsmarks. And so the country was totally out of control. Despite odds against him, Hitler was able to take advantage of that situation, that populist need, and he had started his own party after World War I. It was called the National Social German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, and within the first decade, he was able to garner enough support that in the election of 1932-33, he had the plurality of votes in the nation, and he was immediately made chancellor. Now, the leaders who might have fought against him were old and tired. They were worn out by the Weimar Republic, and they simply yielded. They gave up. Within days, Hitler had solidified his power. It wasn't always clean. The Reichstag did burn down. There were a couple of murders. But he was the chancellor. And what he did, he called all the generals to take an oath personally that they would follow him. Not the country, but to him personally. An oath that they deeply regretted as the war proceeded. Within a decade, a large minority of the German people were pleased with Hitler's success. During my research, I came across a book written by a man named Milton Meyer, which was called They Thought They Were Free. After the World War II, he moved with his family to Germany, his small family, and went to a small village where he got well acquainted with about 10 families. He spent a year there, and the people trusted him. Now, this was a time of great isolation between the different towns. This was a town that it didn't have television. There were no newspapers that interested him. In fact, the town crier would sing a song at 11 o'clock at night, the same song that was sung in the 1500s. The town simply had not changed, was not aware of what was happening in the world. And in his adopted town, the family said, these Hitler years were the happiest years of our lives. Nationwide, in 1939, there were 8,000 day nurseries, paid holidays for workers, homes for unwed mothers, extra food allotments for large families, state-paid old age insurance, rent supplements, unemployment and disability benefits, old age homes, free interest loans for married couples, services for ex-convicts, on and on. By 1939, 17 million German citizens were receiving assistance. And as many of you know, he was instrumental in starting the Autobahn infrastructure project, and he encouraged the creation of the Volkswagen. All very popular programs. Most of the people in that village were honestly not aware that these same benefits were not being shared by the entire country. At that time, Germany was primarily an agricultural country. There were small estates in what are now the villages. The estate, the big house in the center, and then scattered about maybe 60 workers' houses. And the aristocrats owned the estates, and they were very proud of the way they ran their estate. They were intentionally very moralistic in the way they operated. They cared for their workers. They were the face of Germany for centuries. The aristocrats, people with von in their name, like von Bismarck or von Tresckow. And of course, many people in Germany still have those names, but the social situation has changed. Upon they sent their children to military academies for education, and mostly men. Women were not well regarded in Germany at the time. And upon graduation from military academy, these young aristocrats were automatically made officers in the army. But they were appalled at what they were seeing in Hitler. It was totally contrary to any of their moral standards. They despised Hitler for his lack of military knowledge and for his abandonment of human issues. In the course of the 1930s, many people, perhaps a majority, realized that the moral fiber of the country was seriously unraveling. Hitler was ruthless in confronting anyone who showed any sign of opposing him. For example, a few years later, a woman sent a letter to her son who was fighting in Stalingrad. The letter was read. She was immediately executed for undermining patriotism. The church, at least the minority of the church that had not joined the German Christians, was the first organization to speak out publicly against Hitler. It was 1934 that a few ministers gathered in the small town of Barmen, and after days of discussion, Karl Barth wrote the text of the Barmen Declaration. From this was born the confessing church, made up about 1/3 of the church population, that didn't challenge Hitler so much as said the church should be in charge of the church and not Hitler in charge of the church. And the state should be in charge of the state. Like Lutheran theology has been for decades, that the state takes care of the state and the church takes care of the church, and never the two shall meet. So the confessing church was never a very serious challenge to Hitler. In fact, he said, I'll postpone dealing with the church until after the war. Nevertheless, many of the young ministers who made up the confessing church were hounded. There was a Gestapo agent assigned to each minister, who was always in church to make sure the minister didn't say anything against the state. And then some, of course, suffered deeply. Martin Niemoller, who was a very popular captain in the submarine corps in the First World War, had joined the church, and Hitler arrested him and called him his personal prisoner for life. And then it was in support of the confessing church that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose name many of you know, was detained in Tegel prison for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, he was arrested and sent to Flossenburg, and he was shot in a firing line. While a significant number and minority of church people absolutely objected to what was happening to the Jews, many believed that they were just being sent to other communities which would be all Jewish and where they'd be happy. The teaching of the church was so very anti-Semitic that many people felt that rounding up the Jews was justified. Others were appalled, but by the time they realized the extent of the Jewish Holocaust, it was very dangerous to object openly. Anyone who showed any signs of objecting to Hitler's policies was annihilated. it was not just the church that was anti-Semitic. The list of philosophers in Germany wrote disgracefully anti-Semitic statements is staggering. Immanuel Kant, Nietzsche, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Spengler, Heidegger, the list goes on. And Heidegger was a member of Hitler's inner circle at the same time that he was dating a young Jewess whose name was Hannah Arendt. It might surprise you to know that Hitler read these philosophers. He was a very intelligent scholar, and he was greatly encouraged that these philosophers had written strong statements that would support his own Aryan philosophy. Despite the fact that I'm getting dry. Despite the fact that opposition was so dangerous, there were many forms of a resistance. Some of them so hidden that we'll never know about them. Of course, they have no records, because if the records were found, it would be very dangerous. About 45 years ago, a friend of mine was doing some research on this very topic. Widerstand is the word in German. She got a phone call, an anonymous phone call, and a woman on the other end said, I don't want to be known. I'll drop off some papers in the mailbox, and I think they'll be of interest to you. I don't want to be known because the man who lives next door to me was a Gestapo agent, and I simply don't want to create any tension in the neighborhood. So she left the papers in the mailbox, and they contained information of how housewives in her neighborhood had secluded a Jewish family throughout the entire war. And it was reported subsequently, but they were never identified for what they had done. This is extremely dangerous. We know the story of Anne Frank, but that's a different country, and even in that case, they were caught. There's no record of how many common people struggled against this monster. And we know, I once had a book, I seem to have lost it, of 100 pictures of single individuals who opposed Hitler, and of course were all executed. There was the story of Franz Jaegerstaetter. A book has been written about him by Gordon Zahn called In Solitary Witness. His neighbors, he was an Austrian farmer. His neighbors, even his priest, pleaded with him to soften his stand, but he said, no, my Catholic tradition demands that I speak out. And he, of course, was executed. You may have seen in the Times 2 weeks ago an op-ed about the what was it called? The White Rose. And Sophie Scholl was a 23-year-old student in a university in the southern part of Germany. And she and her brother Hans and a couple of professors dropped leaflets in the balcony of the university where they were studying. The janitors saw what they were doing, reported them, and within 3 days, they were all beheaded. And you can see she's the joyful young. And the picture on the left is a more serious face, but she'd love to be in the country, walking, dreaming, writing poetry. A very innocent and lovely woman. In addition to the individual objection to Hitler, there were many small groups that formed. But the history, again and again, I say, is so obscure because of the danger. In fact, many of the resistors had never heard of the Solf circle, S-O-L-F, following the woman Johanna Solf, until 150 were executed by the Gestapo. Increasingly, the military were finding it absolutely impossible to do their work under Hitler. And they wanted to rid him, hopefully with a coup d'etat. But they'd taken the oath. And for them, an oath was absolutely inviolable. That's the level of moral integrity that they showed. They couldn't see facing Hitler in that way, having taken that oath. Eventually, there were about 15 attempts by the military to create a coup d'etat. The first under a man whose name is Henning von Tresckow. I'm not sure, Henning von Tresckow. He was the chief of staff of the Second Army, a very high officer. His attempt at a coup d'etat failed. Hitler was simply uncanny, sometimes just lucky, in avoiding execution. On the other hand, Hitler despised the military, but he needed them. But when they would not agree to his violence, he called them sissies, or he said, "My Salvation Army," ringing bells outside stores in Christmas time. He eventually formed his own army, called the Einsatzgruppen, the SS, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, who became his execution squad, killing people with abandon. The general understanding among the resistors was that the military would get rid of Hitler, and then the civilians would establish immediately a new Germany. And to that end, they began to choose people who would take the offices, mayor, governor, administrative officers of all the states in Germany, so that the moment Hitler was eliminated, they could fall into place. There were, in the end, two primary civilian groups. There was a conservative group with Karl Friedrich Goerdeler in charge. We got him here. And his group was made up primarily of officers, not military officers, but mayors, governors, people who had held office before. He had been the mayor of Leipzig himself. And what this group wanted was to restore Germany to the place that it was before the war began. Another liberal group was gathered around Heinrich von Moltke. This is Moltke at age 21, this one. The other one is during his trial. The von Moltke's group wanted to change the whole European scene. They wanted to eliminate the borders between the small countries that had been at war for decades, if not centuries, and build a totally new Europe once peace had been established. Von Moltke's group has interested me in particular. He was very international in his upbringing, and he was a good friend of George Kennan, the American diplomat who, when he retired, went to Princeton, the Center of Advanced Studies. And he wrote in his memoirs, and this is significant, "I consider von Moltke, in fact, to have been the greatest person, morally, and the largest and most enlightened in his concepts that I met on either side of the battle lines in the Second World War." And then he goes on to talk about his fight for in the Widerstand. The image of this lonely, struggling man, one of the genuine Protestant Christian martyrs of our time, has remained for me over the intervening years as a pillar of moral conscience and an unfailing source of political and intellectual inspiration. Close quotes. And I would add that not only did his moral integrity guide his own life, but brought many others to him who wanted to follow in the direction he was going. He had many friends, leaders throughout the country from all walks of life, and he was very deliberate in integrating his group. Their first meetings were held in his home estate, which is called Kreisau, near Bavaria, near the southeastern part of Germany. And there was they developed constant meetings. 3 meetings were held in the estate of Kreisau themselves. As is very unusual, there were several women in his group also, including his esteemed wife, whose name was Freya von Moltke, F-R-E-Y-A. And as the meetings became more dangerous, they would meet in little apartments around, mostly in Berlin and other cities. And in each meeting, they would be assigned, the group would be assigned, you study how the new financial system should work. You study how the education system would work. And so they were envisioning an entirely new way of doing things in this comprehensive and with a country without borders, a new Europe. Now, early in the struggle, von Moltke realized that nothing could be done outside the government, and that it would be only from inside could they eliminate Hitler. And so to that end, he joined what was called the Abwehr, a most anomalous organization. The Abwehr was the head of the German military intelligence, and it was run by a very crafty Admiral Canaris, who was very close to Hitler, who was with him often. At the same time, he was protecting the resistors who were part of his organization. And so they worked for several years with his cover. At first, von Moltke did some work in the law of war, which the military would respect, even though Hitler wouldn't. And many lives were saved as a result. In fact, the invasion of Denmark was avoided because of the way the words of the law of war read. And then von Moltke longed for a negotiated settlement. He had lots of friends in England. A special friend was Bishop Bell, who was both a member of the parliament and was a bishop of the church. And they met together in Norway to see what could be done about a negotiated settlement. And one of these trips to Norway, Bonhoeffer went with him because Bonhoeffer was also, for a while, a member of the Abwehr, protected by Admiral Canaris. Unfortunately, the efforts of a negotiated peace never went very far because the Brits imagined that these were all traitors or spies, and they couldn't be persuaded otherwise. The Kreisau Circle, as it was called, or in German, the Kreisau Kreis, which means Kreis meaning circle, continued to focus on the new Europe until peace was established. The big day for the opposition came on July 20, 1944. It's still a day of remembrance in Germany, 20. Juli. Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was the chief of staff of the general office, detonated a bomb in the bunker where Hitler was working. Many of you know this story. And the bomb went off, and all of the people who had been prepared to take over in the new Germany took their positions. 4 hours later, Hitler went on television, on radio, to say that he was alive and well and hadn't been hurt at all. And immediately, 7,000 men were shot. Those who had revealed the fact that they were willing to struggle against. That's the extent of the danger and the extent of the violence to be part of a resisting force in those days. By fate of fortune, von Moltke himself was not known to be a participant in the resistance because he was in prison on some other charge. And it wasn't until Admiral Canaris's diary was read that von Moltke's name came up. He was immediately arrested, and he went before a brilliant and bloodthirsty judge, Roland Freisler. I didn't want to put his picture up. And normally Freisler just automatically passed a death sentence. But in von Moltke's case, he knew of him as a brilliant lawyer, and he himself was a brilliant lawyer. They sparred in court for quite a long while, unusually long. And at the end, they'd come to the conclusion that both National Socialism and the Christian Church demanded the total loyalty of the man, and that these two were incompatible. Therefore, he was sentenced to death because he was a Christian. And he wrote to his wife that night from prison, "I'm so proud I'll be executed because I'm a Christian." That's a picture of the Plotsensee execution chamber, where with 5, I don't know if you can see them, but 5 hooks, piano wire was attached to the hooks, and that's where the hangings took place. Let's move on as far as the slides are concerned. We'll go to a picture of his wife, Freya von Moltke, which is much more pleasant to look on. Christian socialist values were always at the center of the Kreisauer deliberations. Leaders of the other group always referred to him as the Christians. And you have to know that at that time, to say Christians was not exclusive. There was no other religion. There were no Muslims. Jews had been eliminated. That was the religion of Germany. The basic lesson of the German resistance was that the state and national authority should no longer be regarded as absolutes. I think that's very significant. What the states say is not an absolute. There's a form of morality that judges what the state does. And that the primary goal of policy should be the standard of values worthy of the dignity of human life. It's instructive and inspiring to note that reading the prescriptions for the new state, how central moral and ethical values were. The leaders themselves were of impeccable standards. The papers that they read did not mention Hitler's disorder, but concentrated on a vision and structure of a new Europe. There's no historical line between what they talked about and what the present EU is. So their proposal was totally abandoned after the war. They wrote, the members of the Kreisauer Circle, quote, "The free exercise of conscience and the acknowledgement of the inviolable dignity of the human person are the foundation of the legal and international order that should be aimed at." As an example, these groups trying to imagine what the new world would look like, the group that was in charge of education prospect wrote as follows: "Education ought to arouse and strengthen a student's moral values." That's the first goal. "Character training produces an upright person who's able to adopt as the guidelines of his behavior good morals and lawfulness, truth and sincerity, love of his neighbor, and loyalty to his conscience. Learning helps toward the moral formation of a personality and prepares for the practical life." This would be the education philosophy. I could say a lot more about Freya von Moltke, and perhaps I will later. But this, I want to conclude with this. I want to tell you about Madeline Bunting. She was an editor and columnist of the Guardian newspaper, called the Manchester Guardian until it became national. It's a prestigious left-leaning newspaper in New Britain. She just proposed a study project which would be called Citizen Ethics in a Time of Crisis. And in launching this project with a dozen others in the UK, she wrote this: "Fundamental questions of justice persist, but without any influence on the public debate." That's what the crisis of ethics is really about. We have no language to use. "This is wrong" has long since had any vitality, any legitimacy in a political statement. I can think of no more important way of confronting the present political and economic malaise than to accept the challenge laid down by Bunting to live daily lives that exemplify the high moral standards espoused by those who failed to stop Hitler's machine, but who, now facing execution, were content that they had lived with integrity. What she's saying, in effect, is there's some talk of morality, but it never affects the leadership. It never affects the Congress, so to speak. Fundamental questions of justice persist, but without any influence in the public debate. This is what the crisis of ethics is about. We have no language to use. "This is wrong" has long since ceased to have any validity as a political statement. I mean, you can say that about our Congress constantly. This is wrong, but it has no impact. There's no moral plumb line by which any of this is judged. And that's why I think the best we can do is seek to be that moral force in our own lives.